Some said the studios were temples, that Hollywood was Olympus reborn, its gods and goddesses draped not in marble, but in silk and sequins. But no temple was ever built without hidden chambers. No Olympus stood without thunderclouds gathering just out of sight. The stars knew this better than anyone. Their smiles were rehearsed, their movements choreographed, their secrets carefully buried beneath velvet curtains of charm. Yet every performance left a residue, a silence when the cameras stopped, a weight that even champagne could not always lift. In those silences, strange comforts were born, a ritual repeated until it dulled the noise, an object treasured far beyond reason, a craving whispered into the night. They were not always vices in the way the tabloids imagined. Sometimes they were fragile lullabies, small acts of survival in a world that refused to let its stars simply be human. She smiled for the camera and cried when it turned away. The audience never saw it. They were not meant to. That was the contract, to give your soul to the spotlight, and in return be adored. But what happens when adoration cannot heal loneliness, when applause cannot soften the ache of being seen yet never truly known? Hollywood's strange addictions were not just curiosities. They were escape routes carved into gilded walls. Some led to disaster, others to quiet endurance. Each addiction was a story, not of weakness, but of longing. A longing to rest, a longing to belong, a longing for love in a world built on illusion. And so, as we lift the velvet curtain tonight, we enter a theatre few were ever invited to see. A theatre not of scripts or sets, but of secret habits and fragile hearts. The lights are dim, the air is hushed. Their stories are waiting. She was born Frances Ethel Gum, a child of vaudeville, raised beneath the harsh glow of stage lights, before most children ever learn the comfort of shadows. Her life had always been framed in performance. From the very beginning, the applause of strangers was the lullaby that carried her into sleep, and the stage, not the home, was where she felt most expected to exist. But expectation has weight, and Hollywood, even in its golden age, carried demands that bent bones and broke hearts. Judy Garland was just a teenager when she became Dorothy, the girl who followed a yellow brick road into cinematic eternity. To the world, she was innocence itself, ruby slippers and wide-eyed wonder. But behind the curtain, the studio executives treated her not as a girl, not even as a woman, but as a commodity, something to polish, sculpt, and perfect until there was nothing left of Frances. The pressure began quietly, almost invisibly. Long hours on set demanded energy she did not naturally have. And so small tablets were handed to her with a smile. Pep pills, they called them, tiny miracles to keep her awake, keep her cheerful, keep her performing. When exhaustion dragged her down at night, the cycle reversed. Another pill, this one to silence her racing mind, to deliver her to sleep quickly, efficiently, so she could awaken and begin again. This was not indulgence, not weakness, not even rebellion. It was survival. Hollywood had woven her into a clockwork machine, and pills became the gears that kept it running. At first, they were helpers, companions almost, capsules that promised rest when her body trembled with fatigue, or vitality when her eyelids grew heavy under the hot studio lamps. But time has a way of transforming small comforts into unrelenting chains. What began as assistance grew into necessity. Her body forgot how to sleep without them, how to wake without them, how to breathe without the quiet crutch of chemicals dissolving in her bloodstream. The world never saw this. To the world, Judy was radiant, a girl with a voice that could pierce through sorrow and land like a prayer on the listener's heart. Her laughter was rehearsed but convincing, her eyes alive with a spark that suggested joy. The public adored her, and in their adoration, they unknowingly asked her to endure a life she could not bear. Loneliness is a strange hunger, Applause can fill it for a moment, but once the curtains close, the silence echoes louder than any ovation. Judy Garland's nights were often the hardest. She was a woman adored by millions, yet she fell asleep alone, surrounded only by the bottles lying neatly on her nightstand. Pills to wake, pills to sleep, pills to quiet the thoughts that whispered she was never enough. Her addiction was never about seeking euphoria. She was not chasing thrill or oblivion. She was chasing stillness, a moment of peace in a life that demanded endless motion. For Judy, addiction was the promise of silence in a world that would not let her rest. And yet, that silence was fleeting. Each capsule granted relief only to snatch it back hours later, leaving her emptier, hungrier, more fragile. The cycle spun on and on, as relentless as the spotlight. Her voice, the one that carried over the rainbow into eternity, was her gift to the world. But the world never gave her the rainbow she longed for. Pills became her way of painting the sky in borrowed colors, temporary hues that faded by dawn. And so Judy Garland lived as two people, the eternal Dorothy, cherished forever on screen, and the fragile woman who longed for nothing more than a night of unbroken sleep. Her story is not one of shame, but of tenderness, of a heart that sought peace in the only elixir it was ever offered. Judy's addiction was not to fame, nor to the shimmering stage. It was to the brief, merciful stillness that medicine granted her, a stillness she never could hold, but always hoped to find again. Errol Flynn lived his life as if it were written by the same screenwriters who gave him his legendary roles. To the world, he was Robin Hood incarnate, the daring buccaneer, the reckless prince who swung from chandeliers and outdueled villains with a grin. Yet beyond the camera, when the costume was hung and the applause had faded, Flynn seemed incapable of setting down the sword. His addiction was not merely to alcohol or women, though both filled his days and haunted his nights, but to the chase itself, the constant pursuit of youth, danger, and fleeting desire. The tabloids painted him as a reckless libertine, but there was a truth behind the ink and the scandal. Flynn could not tolerate silence. The empty hours of sobriety pressed down on him like a weight he could not bear. He filled them with laughter too loud, adventures too dangerous, and indulgences too extreme. For Flynn, every night needed to feel like a climax. Every day, another act in a story he refused to let end. The bottle became his most reliable companion. He drank not simply for pleasure, but for propulsion, as if the burn of liquor could keep time itself at bay. A glass was never just a drink, it was a sword against the creeping spectre of age, a shield against the loneliness that stalked him when the crowds went home. He gulped down gin as if it might restore his vitality, as if within it he could bottle the vitality of youth he feared was slipping away. Women, too, were part of his theatre. To Flynn, they were not simply lovers but symbols of the chase. Each conquest was a reaffirmation that he was still desired, still magnetic, still the man who could captivate with a smile and a reckless dare. The women were not trophies to him but lifelines, proof that he had not yet grown old, not yet been left behind by the unstoppable current of time. Yet, inevitably, when morning came, the thrill faded, and Flynn would begin again, seeking in another embrace what he had lost in the last. Beneath the bravado lay a man haunted by the inevitability of decline. Errol was never content with stillness. Sobriety meant facing truths he could not endure. It meant acknowledging that even heroes grow tired, even swashbucklers lose their speed. Stillness was his enemy, and so he ran from it, night after night, bottle after bottle, embrace after embrace. There is a tragedy in this endless motion. To audiences, Flynn was forever young, forever grinning as he leapt into battle with sword raised high. But in reality, his youth was slipping faster than he could catch it. Each drink was an attempt to rewind the clock, each affair a desperate prayer that time would pause in the presence of beauty. Yet time, indifferent, marched on, and Flynn's body bore the cost. His health withered under the weight of excess, his once sharp features lined too quickly, his once mighty frame weakened by indulgence. Still, the charm never left him entirely. Even in decline, there was a sparkle in his eye, a roguish smile that suggested he was still playing a part, still chasing something no one else could see. And perhaps that was the essence of his addiction. Not alcohol, not women, not even fame, but the feeling of being forever just out of reach, forever chasing the horizon of youth and vitality. Errol Flynn's legacy remains divided. The daring hero on screen, immortalized in celluloid, and the restless soul off-screen, undone by the very chase that defined him. His was a life lived at a sprint, a performance that could not pause, not even for breath. For Flynn, sobriety was not about resisting alcohol. It was about resisting stillness, and stillness was unbearable. His addiction, then, was to motion itself, to live in constant pursuit, to run until there was nowhere left to run. And in that pursuit, he became a tragic legend, a man forever chasing a youth that no man could keep. Bette Davis was not merely an actress, she was a storm dressed in silk, a fire bottled into the fragile frame of a woman who refused to be tamed. Her voice, gravel mixed with velvet, rolled across theatres like smoke through a half-open door, impossible to contain, impossible to ignore. Her eyes, large and luminous, could cut a man to ribbons or cradle him into surrender without a single line of dialogue. She was power, on screen, command incarnate, the woman who never blinked when others turned away. But behind that power, behind the gowns and the carefully choreographed glances, was a quieter ritual, a dependency so constant it became part of her myth. Cigarettes. Hollywood called it glamour, a symbol of sophistication, a prop of desire. But for Bette, the cigarette was not a decoration, it was survival. From her earliest days on set, surrounded by lights hot enough to melt wax and directors whose demands bordered on cruelty, she found comfort in the slim white cylinder between her fingers. A cigarette steadied her hands when nerves threatened to betray her, gave her something to hold in, moments when silence stretched too long. Each inhale filled her lungs not with calm, but with a rhythm, a reminder that she could control at least one thing in a world that never stopped demanding. Her addiction was quiet, subtle. She did not chase the wild intoxication of alcohol or the blurred release of pills. She sought something gentler, steadier, a thin veil of smoke that kept the world at just enough distance. To her audience, she was fearless, a hurricane who could stride across a room and bend it to her will. Yet even hurricanes need stillness, and hers came not from rest, but from the curl of smoke rising, swirling, vanishing into the air. On set, cigarettes became part of her performance. Watch closely, and you will see. Every pause is punctuated by a drag, every sharp line followed by the exhale of mist, as though her words needed a physical echo. Cigarettes were not props, but punctuation, a way of turning silence into command. When she lit one, she held not just fire, but control. Off-screen, they became her companions. In the loneliness of hotel rooms, in the quiet after a scene wrapped and applause faded, she reached for the lighter as one might reach for prayer beads. Each flick of flame, each inhale, was a meditation, a rhythm against loneliness, against the weight of being a woman in power in a world designed to break women who dared to hold it. The studios glamorized it. Posters showed her framed in smoke, eyes piercing through the haze. Audiences copied her, imitating not only her roles, but the ritual itself. But the truth was less about glamour and more about survival. Cigarettes gave her something that applause never could, a private shield. With every exhale, she built a curtain, a veil between herself and the gaze of the world, between her and the loneliness of being untouchable. And perhaps that was the most dangerous part of her addiction. Not the nicotine, not the slow erosion of health, but the comfort. Cigarettes gave her the illusion of safety, the illusion of control. They were always there, ready to be lit, ready to turn silence into smoke, fear into ritual. Her addiction was not simply to nicotine, but to the act itself, the drama of smoke rising and vanishing, echoing the fleeting nature of applause, of fame, of even love. Like her performances, the smoke was powerful, unforgettable. But it never stayed. Bette Davis's cigarette curtain was both shield and stagecraft, survival and self-sabotage. Behind it stood a woman who refused to dim her fire, even as she cloaked herself in smoke. Howard Hughes was a man of contradictions. To the world, he embodied power, innovation, and reckless daring. He built planes that soared higher and faster than imagination could keep up with, produced films that broke cinematic boundaries, and amassed a fortune so large it seemed limitless. Yet behind this dazzling exterior, he was locked inside a cage of obsession, one of his own making. Unlike other Hollywood figures, Hughes's addiction wasn't primarily to substances that dulled pain. His intoxication came from control, from the attempt to bend a chaotic world to his rigid will. It started small, rituals of cleanliness, exacting standards in his business, and meticulous demands in filmmaking. But with time, his obsessions grew sharper, stranger, and more consuming. He washed his hands until his skin cracked and bled, terrified of germs that no one else could see. He ordered his assistants to store his possessions in precise ways, often wrapped and rewrapped in layers of tissue paper to prevent contamination. He recorded endless memos, sometimes hours long, dictating rules about how to handle even the most trivial details of his life. It was not eccentricity for the sake of theatrics, it was compulsion. Each act was an attempt to quiet the storm inside him, a ritual of control performed against an unseen terror. For a man who built machines meant to conquer the sky, Hughes was paradoxically earthbound, tethered by the invisible chains of his obsessive-compulsive disorder. His mind, so brilliant in its visions, turned on itself, magnifying small fears into towering catastrophes. While others saw him as reclusive, even mad, what truly consumed him was the impossible chase for perfection. The dust on a doorknob, the wrinkle in a shirt, the shadow of a germ, these became monumental enemies in his battle for control. And yet, his obsessions fueled his genius as much as they destroyed him. It was his refusal to accept imperfection that gave birth to aircraft like the H-1 Racer, a plane so advanced it broke speed records and altered aviation forever. It was the same restless mind that poured millions into Hell's Angels, revolutionizing aerial cinematography. The brilliance and the madness were inseparable, two sides of the same coin spinning endlessly in his psyche. But the cost was devastating. The older Hughes grew, the more his compulsions deepened, carving away at his freedom. He retreated into darkened hotel rooms, blocking out light with heavy curtains, refusing human contact for weeks at a time. His body withered from malnutrition as his routines consumed his days. Bottles of milk and tissues piled around him, silent markers of a man drowning in his own rules. The tycoon who once commanded empires now lived in shadows, prisoner to rituals that offered no escape. What made his cage even crueler was that it was invisible to the world outside. To the public, Hughes remained a mythic figure, a recluse shrouded in mystery, a genius too strange to comprehend. But behind the myth was a man shackled not by wealth, fame, or enemies, but by his own mind. The same obsessions that had propelled him to greatness dragged him into isolation, leaving him unable to taste the freedom his airplanes had once promised. Howard Hughes's story is not one of indulgence in the pleasures of Hollywood excess. It is the story of an addiction to control, a desperate attempt to master fear by building walls too high to climb. In that self-made prison, he lived and died, both triumphant and tragic, a man who reached for the skies, but remained forever trapped within the cage of obsession. Tallulah Bankhead did not enter a room, she conquered it. Her presence was thunder wrapped in silk, her laughter crashing through the air like lightning. If others walked, Tallulah blazed, and if others spoke, she roared. Her voice, the eternal weapon and curse, was a sound etched with 100 nights of smoke and whiskey. To hear her speak was to hear both the seduction of life and the erosion of time. She was a woman addicted not to one vice, but to the symphony of all of them, conducted at a tempo only she could endure. Cigarettes were her rosary beads, lit one after another, their embers glowing like sparks from a furnace that refused to cool. She inhaled, as if each drag carried with it the power to keep the world awake, to ward off silence, to keep death itself at bay. Alcohol was her second companion. Champagne, gin, whiskey, anything that could lubricate the wit that made her famous and the bravado that kept the world from seeing her cracks. Her nights stretched until dawn, filled with laughter, scandal, and confessions so outrageous they became legend before the sun had risen. Yet Tallulah's true addiction was not merely to substances. It was to excess itself, the inability, or perhaps the refusal, to live at anything less than a blaze. Where most lived with balance, she lived with fire. Moderation felt like starvation to her, a dimming of the only flame she trusted. She once quipped that she could resist anything except temptation, and she meant it not as humor, but as gospel. Temptation was her oxygen, indulgence, her heartbeat. On stage, her voice commanded audiences like a spell. Off stage, it carried her through salons, hotels, smoky apartments, and endless dinners, where her sharp wit carved everyone present into both admirers and survivors of her charisma. Yet behind the brilliance, her body paid the toll. Every cigarette scraped her throat raw. Every drink hollowed her strength. Doctors warned her, friends pleaded, lovers begged, but Tallulah met such pleas with laughter. To her, slowing down meant dying faster. Her voice became her paradox. That unforgettable rasp, sultry, defiant, instantly recognizable, was the very scar carved by her addictions. It was not simply a tool of performance, but an emblem of her battles. Each performance was carried on smoke-filled lungs, each witty retort fueled by liquid courage, each declaration of love shouted too loudly, too fiercely, as though she could drown out the silence creeping in behind her. Tallulah loved too much, and in too many ways. She loved people recklessly, without filter, without caution, pouring herself into friendships and romances as if each one were the last. But her love, like her life, came in hurricanes. She exhausted those she adored, burned through connections like paper, left behind both worshippers and wounded hearts. The more society demanded restraint from her, as it often demanded of women, the more she answered with chaos, an act of rebellion that consumed her as much as it liberated her. Her addiction, then, was not just to substances, not just to the sound of her own voice, but to life lived at its loudest possible volume. She was terrified of quiet, suspicious of stillness, haunted by the thought of fading gently into the background. So she lived at a pitch so high it scorched her from within, leaving her voice shredded, yet immortal. Tallulah Bankhead did not chase immortality through caution or preservation. She found it in the smoke, in the laughter, in the voice that could never rest. Even in her ruin, she became unforgettable. For her, moderation was death, and excess was the only proof that she had ever truly been alive. Hollywood promised eternity. Its contract was not written in ink but in light, silver beams flickering across velvet theaters, faces preserved in frames that would outlive the fragile bodies behind them. On screen, the stars never aged, never faltered, never trembled. But in the quiet corners of real life, They were only human, fragile, lonely, searching for something to steady themselves against the storm of adoration and expectation. Strange addictions were the scaffolding of their survival. Judy Garland's pills became lullabies, a chemical rhythm to push her body through another performance. Bette Davis's cigarettes were not props, but armor, each plume of smoke a shield between herself and the unbearable quiet. Errol Flynn's reckless escapades on boats, in bedrooms, in bottle-lit nights were not simply hedonism, but desperate pursuits of freedom, chasing wind and waves to escape the creeping fear of stillness. And Tallulah Bankhead, with her champagne voice and chaotic fire, burned herself alive just to feel the room notice her spark. To audiences, these were quirks. To gossip columnists, they were scandals. To the stars themselves, they were lifelines, a way to endure a system that demanded endless sparkle, even when the soul dimmed. Addiction in old Hollywood was rarely about indulgence alone. It was survival. The studio system was a relentless machine, demanding beauty, energy, and smiles on command. Sleep was optional, emotions irrelevant. To keep up, stars borrowed from substances, from compulsions, from rituals that promised control in a life where they owned very little. Their contracts told them when to eat, when to smile, even when to fall in love. Was it any wonder they sought escape in secret bottles, hidden vices, or the small private rebellions that helped them feel alive? Yet these addictions were also cages. Judy's pills robbed her of rest as much as they gave her energy. Bette's cigarettes carved shadows into her lungs as surely as they lit her stage presence. Errol's pursuits left him hollow, chasing pleasures that fled faster each year. Tallulah's flame, too bright, burned her voice into permanent rasp, her legacy forever echoing with the scars of her appetites. Hollywood sold the illusion of immortality, but even its brightest lights flickered out under the weight of being human. Their addictions were not moral failings, though tabloids loved to paint them as such. They were, instead, the echoes of deep longing, for rest, for freedom, for gentleness in a world that only demanded more. And perhaps that is why their stories linger. Not because they were perfect idols, but because they were painfully, achingly human. Their flaws were written into their artistry. Their addictions shaped their performances in ways no script could. When Judy sang of rainbows, she carried the ache of a girl who needed pills to sleep. When Bette's eyes flashed with fire, smoke curled unseen from a cigarette resting just off stage. When Errol charmed the world, laughter echoed hollowly into the bottle at his side. And when Tallulah shouted her wit across smoky rooms, her voice carried the crackle of all she had sacrificed to excess. In the end, Hollywood polished their images, but it was their shadows that made them unforgettable. We remember them not only as stars, but as people who struggled, who yearned, who stumbled beneath the impossible weight of being adored by millions, yet often loved by none. The silent cost of sparkle was not scandal, but solitude, not glamour, but grief. And yet, in their flawed humanity, they gave us something priceless, a reminder that beauty does not live in perfection, but in the trembling courage to live at all. As the credits roll on their lives, the screen darkens. The applause fades. What lingers is not just the brilliance of their roles, but the fragile truth of their humanity, the strange addictions that broke them, and the enduring spirit that made them eternal.